I'd like to introduce, so as you've just heard, the conference is going to be recorded for future use. We are now recording, so this is live. I'd like to introduce our founder, Ron Benetton, who's going to be spending some time with you, going through our product platform and what we're trying to achieve here at JSONR. So, Ron, turn it over to you. We're going to allow for some question and answer at the end of the call. Anybody that has a question during the call, feel free to stop us and pose a question into the chat box. I will be monitoring that. So if you have any questions, feel free to speak up. Ron, take it away. How are you today?
I'm good, thanks, Zach, and hopefully you hear me because I unmuted. And you see my screen?
Yes, I believe we can.
Okay, excellent. So thanks all for joining. My name's Ron. I'm one of the co-founders in the company, and we've been doing MongoDB implementations for a very long time. We used to be a consulting company, and at some point we saw that we were building the same set of tools and applications for all our customers. So we decided to create JSON Studio. And what I'll do today is I'll take you through a part of JSON Studio, not through all of JSON Studio, but really focus on how easy it is to be able to view data, discover patterns in the data, visualize data inside MongoDB using JSON Studio. And if you look at JSON Studio as a whole, it is a very diverse suite of tools. It's actually the most comprehensive and really the only suite of tools completely devoted to MongoDB. And you have all kinds of tools all the way from ETL tools, QA tools, development tools, profiling tools, resource management tools, et cetera, et cetera. And because it is so comprehensive, it was the tool that received the Innovation Award in the tooling category from MongoDB itself. Um, and we were very proud of that at JSONR. And just to give you an idea, other companies that got this award for MongoDB are eBay, LinkedIn, eHarmony, Lockheed Martin. So we feel very proud. We're in good company. Um, and really, what I'm going to do today is not focus on the entire tool set because it is large. What I'll do is I'll focus on the elements within JSON Studio with which you view MongoDB documents, you explore their structure, you do basic querying, you look at the schema inside MongoDB, you build analytic queries, you run reports, you visualize data, et cetera, et cetera. And really, there are two main patterns that I'm going to go through in this hour. The first is I'm going to be, think of this as a power user, okay? Either a developer or, a semi-developer or a QA person or an analyst who is familiar with MongoDB. And I'm going to explore the data and build all sorts of queries, but do it in a way that is not painful. Okay, it's not. I won't have to worry about the curly brackets so often. Okay, so it'll be very easy for me to build the queries. And then once I do that, I'll show you the other pattern, the pattern by which a power user defines a query, creates some parameters to that query, and then exposes that query or that report or that chart to other business users, to users who have no idea what MongoDB is and don't want to know what MongoDB is. But since your data is residing in MongoDB, you still need to give them access to this application. Okay, so that's this last bullet point over here is the second pattern where a power user builds things, and then you have data consumers who are consuming these reports or data. Okay. So the rest of what I'll do is really just use the tools. So I'm not going to really use slides. I'm just going to show you what it looks like. And I'm going to use some data that I pulled from Crunchbase. So Crunchbase is a website that tracks companies, usually startups, but they really track all kinds of companies. So for example, if I go to Crunchbase and I put in MongoDB, okay, and I do a search on that, what you'll see is that it gives me, how much money this company MongoDB has raised, how many rounds, how many investors, where their offices are, who their main executives are, et cetera, et cetera. And the nice thing about Crunchbase is that they give you also an API. And the API is a JSON-based API, meaning you can make a call into Crunchbase to give it a company name, and you get a JSON document that describes that company. And really, their entire website is then based on building a simple UI on top of JSON. And so what I did was I called their API to get data from for many companies, and I put it into MongoDB. And this is the data that I'm going to be using in order to show you, how I explore this data. Okay, so this screen that you're seeing right now is the login screen for JSON Studio. And when I log into JSON Studio, what I'm really doing is I'm doing a back-to-back connection into MongoDB. Okay, so I'm going to give it my, where my MongoDB instance is, what port it's listening on, which database I want to connect to. And when I connect, what happens is the first thing that happens is JSON Studio goes and collects all the metadata about the collections and databases, et cetera. So for example, you see here at the top left, you see all my databases in my cluster. Okay, so the database that I'm going to use is called companies. Okay, so you see companies has 19 collections. These are the stats for this database. If I expand this, I get all the collections inside this database. And the collection I'm going to use right now is the companies collection. Okay, so if I look at the stats, this collection has 54,000 JSON documents, each one representing one of these companies. Okay, so if I click on the collection, I start exploring the data. What it does, it opens up a cursor. I can see each one of these documents. Okay, and I can start seeing the structure. So you see every JSON document that describes a company, has the name of the company, has the URL of the company, the number of employees the company has. And then there are all kinds of arrays, which is very typical with MongoDB data or JSON data. For example, I have a relationships array. So relationships is an array of documents. Each document inside this array is a person, which is important, like an executive or someone in the management team. They wouldn't list here, for example, every single employee in the company. And I have an array of people. I have an array of offices because this company may have offices in multiple places. And so it's very easy for me to view the data. Okay, so now suppose that I also want to query the data. Okay, and let's start with a very, very simple query. Say that I want to query, I want to get all of the companies that have more than 600 employees, or at least 600 employees. Okay, so how would I do that? What I would do is I'd say, okay, I want to add a condition. The condition has an operator and it has the value that I want to operate on. So in this case, I'll say I want the query to be larger than, and I want the number of employees to be larger than 600. So all I'll do is I'll double click the 600. And you see that what it did, here is the query that it's constructing for me. It said, okay, I'm going to do a query on the company's collection. I'm going to do a find where the number of employees is greater than 600. So that's my query that, I could have typed it in the shell, but I'd have to deal with the syntax. And maybe I also want only the companies that were founded after 1996. So again, I just add another condition. Okay, and then maybe I don't want, you see here is my result set, right? So it's I'm still seeing all of the documents in the collection. Maybe that's not what I want to know. I just want to know the name of the company, when it was founded, and the number of employees in the company. So what I'll do is I'll do another double click, okay, or I'll do a shift double click. So I'll double click on the name and on the number of employees and on the year it was founded. And you see that as I'm doing it, the studio is automatically refreshing the query and running it. So it's showing me what I want to see, what year it was founded and what name, et cetera, et cetera. And if I want, for example, to sort this by the year, okay, then I sort and maybe descending. So I say sort descending, and then I do a control, double click on the founded year. Okay, so you see I'm now getting the companies that are founded most recently that I have in my database, over 600 employees. And by the way, you can see here that some of the data that comes out of Crunchbase is dirty, right? It's Crunchbase sometimes has flaws in its data. For example, I have no idea who So We are, but I'm pretty sure they don't have 2 billion employees. Okay, so you can get bad data when you pull out of Crunchbase, just for your information. So this is a very simple query, and then of course, once I'm in this, I can, ask for a report on this, or I can download this information into a spreadsheet if I wanted to. Right, and it would open it into Excel with exactly the columns that I wanted, so I could maybe do further processing somewhere else. So it just is very easy for a user to get at data. But everything I showed you right now is fairly simple in terms of queries. It's not really analytics. You wouldn't call this analytics. So before I go into the analytics piece, one more thing that's very useful in terms of exploration and data discovery is the notion of schema exploration. And so in Mongo, there is no such thing as a schema, right? Every document is completely flexible. You can put into this collection any structure that you want. Now, normally you don't really find that it is completely wild, right? Usually a collection has a consistent or a semi-consistent structure of the documents, but there are variants, right? That's really the most useful use case of MongoDB, is when your data doesn't have a fixed schema. But when you don't have a fixed schema, it is very useful to be able to explore the schema, because there still is a de facto schema. If you look at all the documents and you were to look at their structure, then you would be able to say what the schema is. And that's exactly what the Schema Viewer is, right? So if I go here, and you see here, there's a link called Schema Viewer. I can click it, and what it'll do is it'll show me the current schema of this collection as it is right now. Okay, so what does that mean? It means that the studio goes and looks at the structure of all of the documents in this collection, or a sampling of the documents in this collection, and it presents me with the schema of those documents. Okay, so what do I see here? So on the left-hand side, I see all the fields that exist in all of the documents inside this collection. And per document, it shows me what the data structure or the data type is. So for example, you can see that some of them are very consistent. Like for example, every document has an ID and it's an OID type. Every document has a created at field, and it's always a string. But for example, you can see here that some of these are null. So for example, let's look at this acquisition, and let me open it up, because acquisition is actually a subdocument. So acquisition in 80% of the documents is a null, and then the rest is a subdocument which has an acquired date, acquired month, acquired year, price amount, etc. And which actually makes sense, because what does acquisition mean? It means that that company was acquired. So 80% of the companies in the Crunchbase database were not acquired yet, but the rest were acquired. And if they were acquired, then they would have an acquisition date, which makes sense. The thing, for example, that doesn't make sense is, why is 3% of these acquire date fields null? And again, that means it's bad data, because if a company was acquired and Crunchbase does its job comprehensively, then all of these acquired companies should have a date. But since Crunchbase works off public records and all kinds of other sources, not always do they know the precise data, or maybe it's because this data is from 1990 and this data wasn't collected. But when you use this for your own database, it helps you clean things up. It helps you look at things and discover that suddenly, a certain field is null or a certain field is completely empty. And if you click on these things, for example, it will show you all the OIDs for which a certain value appears. Okay, and then you can go and clean it up. So it's another type of discovery. It's another type of exploration, which is not really analytical, but useful when you're in the development cycle or the QA cycle. It's just very, very useful. It's also, you can instead of looking at a view like this, you can look at it as a graphic, and what it will show you is a graph that represents the schema. So every bar in here is a field, right? So you see ID is here, and it tells you ID is always an object ID. 100% of them are object IDs. And then you can go here and say acquisition, 80% of them are null. And the other have the subdocument information. And so if you keep this graph around, for example, it can help you a lot in the QA phase, because if your schema changes, it will be very apparent. If you get a new code drop and there's a change in the code, and therefore the schema changes, then you'll see it. You'll see it in a very quick visual way, rather than look at this detailed data. Okay, so now let's go to analytics. Okay, so in analytics or complex queries, if you've been using MongoDB for a while, you know that the find query will only get you so far. And really, if you want to do any type of more complex queries, including groupings and countings and sortings and all kinds of projections, then you'd have to go to the aggregation framework. And the aggregation framework is definitely a very powerful framework. It's also very messy in terms of syntax. And if you've built these aggregations using the shell, well, at least I don't know what your experience is. I can tell you what my experience is. It's kind of like the number of brackets and the number of issues that I do, or the mistakes that I make when I build an aggregation framework, is astounding, and it takes me hours to do even simple things. And this was really the motivation for this tool. It's kind of like, I have a Mac, and the Mac has a really interesting fan. Usually it's dead silent, but when the Mac is working hard, suddenly you'll hear the fan, you'll start hearing it, and it goes up slowly and it cools it down and then it goes down. That's the same way of what happens to me when I use the aggregation framework in the shell. I really feel the stress. I feel like I'm straining myself and working hard, and then when I'm done, I can relax. So the idea behind this tool is to eliminate that stressful phase and just make it very simple. And so the easiest thing for me is I'll just give you a few examples, and I'll run some real queries, and I'll build them. Okay, I'll build them as we go along. Okay, so the idea behind this GUI is to build a pipeline. And let me show you what a pipeline looks like. Let me first bring up a certain pipeline. So you see a pipeline is what's represented here at the top. And an aggregation pipeline in MongoDB is a set of stages. Each stage does a certain transformation. So for example, this is a filter stage. This is a grouping stage. This is a sorting stage. If I pick up one that's a little longer, maybe this one is longer. No. Yeah, I'm just loading different pipelines. The idea is that every document in the source collection goes into the pipeline. Okay, so it goes through these phases, and out comes something on the other side. So for example, if I run this is the result. Okay, and I'll explain these pipelines in a second. I just first want you to understand visually what you're seeing. You're seeing a pipeline that's presented over here. If I click on any one of these stages, the detail of the stage is shown below, right? So it shows me what I'm doing in each stage. And this is the result, okay? And the idea behind the GUI is that in order to build these complex transformations and analytic queries, I don't have to work hard. Okay, so let's take an example, and hopefully in the process, for those of you less familiar with the aggregation framework, it'll also be kind of an intro to aggregation as well. Okay, so let's do a really simple query. Let's look at the source collection or the source document structure. So for example, remember at the beginning, I told you about the relationship array. So every company has a set of VIPs, or people who are higher up, like the CEO and the VP of Business Development and Director of Engineering, et cetera, et cetera. So suppose that I wanted to run an analytic query that doesn't focus on the companies, but focuses on the people. You see, every one of these relationships has a title and has a person, okay? And the person has a name, first name, last name, and some representation that is unique for that person. So say that I wanted to figure out who are the people who are working in many companies, okay, either because they're jumping around between different companies, or they are they're very important in the industry, therefore they sit on the board of advisors for many of these companies, etc. So I want to do a transformation. I want to do a grouping on people, but my document structure is really based on companies. So how would I do that? So because of what I want to do is work on this relationships array, and it is an array, then the first thing that I need to do is I need to flatten this data structure. I need to I need to create documents where each document is specific for the person. And this is what's called in MongoDB, it's called an unwind phase, or in Google Bigtable, for example, it's called the flattening. Okay, so what I do is I add a stage. That's the first stage of my pipeline. And it's something I want to work on the fields. I want to do either a projection or a flattening. And I can give it a name. I can say, I want to unwind the relationship. Okay. And then what I do, since what I want to do is unwind something, all I do is I pick what I want to unwind. So the system knows what arrays exist, and so it's giving me all the arrays. Now I can type it in, but the system helps me. So I say, okay, I want to unwind the relationships. And here's a trick for those of you who are already using the studio. I always set the limit to 100 documents as I'm working. Later, when I want to see all the data, I'll expand it. But when I work, I want it to be very fast. So I always do a limit, and I can run it. And if I run it, then what it'll do is it'll show me on the right-hand side what the result of applying that phase to the original data structure is. So you can see that for the most part, it's all the same, right? You see, it's exactly the same structure. Where it'll differ is in the relationships area. Okay, here on the source, relationships was an array. And here on the target, okay, the relationships is a single document. Okay, where is my relationships? Here. You see here, relationships, it's only one document. And by the way, for those of you who are more on the business analyst side, don't worry, we're still in the power user phase. We're still in the phase where somebody designs the query before they expose it as a report. Okay. So once I have this, now I can go to the next phase. The next phase is now I have a whole bunch of documents that are all specific to a certain person. So if a company ABC has 10 people, I will get 10 documents for company ABC, one per person. So now what I can do is I can do a grouping, and I can group by the person. So what I'll do is I'll add a group phase, and you can see it turns yellow, just so just so I don't get confused, that the data shown here on the right hand side is still belongs to the previous run. It hasn't been updated since I started editing the next phase of my pipeline. And what I'll do is I'll double click on this, because this is what I want to group by, right? This unique name of a person. So I'll double click here. And what it did was it added it automatically over here. And then maybe if I do a count, it'll tell me how many positions did this person have, but maybe I want to do more than that. I also want to know in which companies did that person work. So I'll add it to a new array. and I'll double click on the company name. And I want to know which positions that person held, so I'll double click on the title. And I think I'm pretty much done, so let me run it and see what I get. So indeed, I get kind of what I wanted. I see, okay, Craig Burton had only one job according to Crunchbase in the company called Kinetics, and he was an advisor. But you know what? I'm getting this in the wrong order because I'm getting this in the arbitrary order that the source collection was in. Really, what I want to do is I want to get this based on the people who held the most number of jobs. Okay, so that's a sort stage. So I'll add another stage and I'll pick sort and I'll double click on the count. And that adds it over here. It says count, and the default sort order is descending because that's normally what happens in analytics. You want the top 10 of something. And I'll run it again, and now I'll get something different. I'll get exactly what I wanted. I got Tim, I don't know who this Tim Hanlon is, held 38 positions in 38 different companies. Okay, these are all the companies. And in these positions, he was always either an EVP, a director, or on the board, or an advisor. And so it goes on. Okay, so this is kind of exactly what I wanted, right? And then, from here, of course, I can go and again, produce a report from this. Go and chart this, etc. I'll show you some of the charting in a second. Okay. So this is one example, and again, the idea is, for example, if you're the power user, at this point you can always change the name. You can see the name of the pipeline is something nonsensical. But if I click this and say this is report ABC, okay, and just rename it, then I can save and publish it. And the minute that I publish it, now it's available for my business users to run this report without knowing anything about what's going on underneath. I just gave it a name. And when I give it a name, it becomes an entity that can be called as a report or as a graph or whatnot. And I'll show you some of this a bit later. Okay, so let's do another one. Okay, so this is one example analytic where I got the people from the relationship structure. So now let me do a new pipeline and do something completely different. Okay, and what I'll do now is, you see here, there's, every company has also a set of offices. Okay, so here there's an offices array, and in each office there is an address, etc. So what I want to do is I want to know in which cities in the U.S. there are a lot of startups and how many people are employed by these these companies who are registered or reported on in Crunchbase. Okay, so um, so what I'll do is the first thing, again, because it's an array, I need to do an unwind. Okay, so I do an unwind, but this time I pick the offices. Okay, and then again, I can always run it to see what it looks like, although in this case I probably don't really need it. I know what it's going to look like. So the next thing that I want to do is, given an office, okay, what I want to do is group by the city. Okay, so I'll add a stage. It's going to be a grouping stage. And I'm going to group by the state and the city. And I want to group by both because when I plot the chart, sometimes I'll want to look at the state and sometimes I want to look at the city. And what I want to know is, of course, I want to know, how many companies there are in this state or in this city. Okay, and by the way, it is possible that a certain company has offices in multiple cities in multiple states. You'll see that when I go to the charting section. And what I want to do, in addition, I want to do a summarization. So I pick the sum operator, and I pick the number of employees in the company. So again, I go up, I find the field which has the number of employees. I double click it. So you can see it added an operator called sum with this, right? And I can change the I can change everything here. I don't have to accept the defaults. I can go and change it to emp, sum, or whatnot. Okay, so I'm doing this, and again, I can always test it and see if it's what I want. But I actually want one more thing. I want to sort it, right? I want to sort it based on the count. So actually, let me run it, and then add the sort stage, and sort by count. And run it again. Okay, so the city which has the most number of companies is New York. Not too surprising. Then San Francisco. Then London. And again, I could use this information. I can report on it. But in this case, what I want to do is I want to chart it. Or actually, let me reduce the number of data points. So instead of looking at 100 at a time, I only want to look at the top 50. Okay, so I'll do this, and then I'll go back to my chart. And it presents me with some default chart, but maybe that's not exactly what I wanted. What I want is to plot the city name. So I'll drag the city name to the x-axis, and I'll want it as a column chart. Okay, and I actually don't want the count. So let me just drag only this field into the column, into the x-axis. And what I want to see first is just the count. Okay, so it shows me these are the cities in terms of, New York has the most, San Francisco has next. And again, the reason that it's useful for me to have grouped by both state and by city is that, this is a little misleading, right? New York seems to be way up there, but it's just because New York is very big. Okay, and we all know that most startups are somewhere, or the largest number is somewhere in the Silicon Valley or in the Bay Area. So for example, if instead of the city, I plot the state, so I drag the state into the x-axis, then I'll get something different. Again, not too surprising. You can see New York State only has 2,000, while California has 7,000. So it is very, very simple for me to look at things, change things, look at multiple points, view this as a pie, with the legend, without the legend, view this as multiple data points. And then at any point in time, I can publish this graph and use it without knowing all the details behind the scene. Okay. So let me go to the next one, okay? And I'll show you another one, which is, and since I know at some point I'm going to run out of time, some of these pipelines I pre-built so that I can just load it and show it to you rather than building it from scratch. So this is another interesting pipeline. And the idea behind this pipeline is, if I run it, what you'll see is that I'm doing kind of the same thing that I did before, where every city and state has how many companies there are and what is the total number of employees in that company. But what I also did was I added a latitude and longitude for that city. And the way that I did this is if you look at the original data, okay, and that comes out of Crunchbase, and you look at the offices subdocument, you see that in addition to having the city and the state, it also has a lat long. And Mongo is very good at geospatial data, so it's very convenient. So once I have this lat long, what I can do with JSON Studio is visualize this data directly on a map. So instead of seeing this as a graph, you see here, when I look at this data, I have three links. I can go to a report to view this data. I can go to a chart to view this data, and I can go to a map to view this data. So if I click on the map, what happens is I get all of these data points on a map, and again, not surprising, I can see a very large concentration here. And if I click on one of these things, I see exactly the JSON document itself as it is stored from that aggregation pipeline. So for example, this is the document for Foster City. It has 37 companies, 37 startups in Foster City, employing a total of 3,689 employees. So again, geospatial data would be natural to view on a map versus as a graph or something like that. Okay. So now let's go to yet another type of analytic. And what I'll do now is I'll look at funding information. So for example, if you look at the original data structure, another thing that, if you remember when I started, I showed you kind of the Crunchbase information. One of the things that Crunchbase does is it stores all the funding rounds. So you see here, you know, um, the last funding round for MongoDB was for 150 million Series F, right, from Intel Capital, Sequoia, EMC, etc. And then there's all of the history of their funding, and this is stored in here. So if you look down at inside these documents, there is another field called funding round. It could be empty, right? If this wasn't a company that either didn't raise money or that Crunchbase doesn't have information about it, then it'll be an empty array. But for others, it'll be a real array. And so suppose that what I want to do is I want to start figuring out how much money was invested by the venture capital community by year or by state or by city, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'll do is I'll create a new pipeline and I'll add a stage. And again, usually when I have an array, I start with some kind of an unwind. So I'll unwind this time on the funding. Okay. And really I'll get the same structure that I want, except I'll get a different document for every funding stage. Okay, so what I want to do now is I want to start grouping. So say that I want to group by the year. I want to know how much money was invested per year. Okay, then what I'll do is I'll add a stage, and it'll be a group stage. And again, what I'm going to group by, the structure of this editor is I need to define two things. I need to say what I want to group by, and then I need to define what I want to aggregate, what kind of computation I want to do per each one of these buckets. Okay, so what I want to group by in this case is the funded year. So I'll double click on funded year. And then what I want to know is, for example, how much money was invested. So it's a sum operator on the raised amount. And maybe I also want to know account. An account is so common that it's just in a special button or a special link here. And so if I run this thing, what it did was it went and it took all the 54,000 documents and it grouped it by year and it computed these sums and these counts. And again, usually I would do another sort. And I can sort by the number of deals done or by the amount of money raised. So let me sort by the amount of money raised. And I also want to do one more thing. I want to add another filter stage where I only want to look at things above 1970. Okay, and you asked me why would I do this? It's actually just because the data in Crunchbase before 1970 is very dirty. Okay, and there were far less venture capital activity before 1970, so maybe that's why. So it's just an artificial filter so that I don't have to look at dirty data. And so what I get is I get again this information of exactly this analytic that I wanted. How much money was raised, how many deals were done. If I want to go and draw this, I can do this. I don't have to exit the tool. Everything is very easy. I can just say, okay, I want a line with zoom, and I want the year to be my x-axis, and I want the amount of money in my y-axis, and I get this thing. Okay, so this shows you how much money was invested throughout the years. And if I want to focus on just this last few years, okay, then I get my data points over here. Okay, so again, the idea is you can do any type of data exploration without writing complex code, right? If I go and I look at even something as simple as this, if you look at the code itself, okay, this is the code. This is the code that you would do if you were writing the aggregation yourself. it's not too bad. But if you had one of those longer pipelines that I showed you before, it would be about 3 pages of this thing, and writing it with all of the syntax problems would have taken half a day instead of 5 minutes. Okay. And then I have a few more that I was going to show you or build for you, but I can see that I'm running out of time, and I do want to leave a bit of time for questions. So maybe I'll just I'll show you a few more advanced ones instead of building them. So for example, I have another another piece of data that is maintained within which of these documents have to do with acquisitions. So there's actually two pieces of documents in here. There's something called acquisition, and there's an acquisitions array. So acquisition means if this company was acquired by another company, that instead of a null over here, you would have the details of the company that acquired this company. And acquisitions is an array of all the companies that this company acquired itself. Okay, so with those two pieces of information, you can do any type of analytics that you want in terms of who acquires the most number of companies, and where those acquisitions are done, or anything recursive, like is a company that acquired other companies and then was acquired itself, what can you do with this data? So all this data is always available. And so, for example, I have a pipeline here that looks at this, and what it does is it tells you a kind of relationships between companies. So, for example, if I were to if I were to chart this and use a chart that is, not one of these bars, etc., but something like a relationship chart, you'd get something like this, which would show you, Twitter acquired these companies, and eBay acquired these companies, and Facebook acquired these companies. And if I wanted to go one level further, right, if I wanted to use the recursive nature, I could load something like this, which you can see is a slightly more complex pipeline. But then when you look at the chart, then you see the recursive nature. You see, for example, that, uh, like here I don't have companies that acquired multiple and then were acquired themselves, but you can see the structure, like VMware acquired these, etc. If I load another type of chart based on the same data, I get something like this, which does show me the recursive nature, right? So this is called a Sunburst. And what it shows me is the different layers in the Sunburst are the different levels of acquisition. So for example, if I focus on DivX, okay, what you'll see is that DivX acquired AnySource Media. But then if I click on this, what it'll show me is that later DivX itself was acquired by Sonic Solutions, who also acquired SimpleStar. Okay, so it's very easy for me to visualize everything. And the other nice thing about this chart is that it's parameterized. So it's exactly that type of pattern that I mentioned, which would allow a power user to build something that's relatively complex and then give it to other people who don't have to know what the details are. So for example, if I go back to the pipeline and I look at the contents of this stage, okay, you'll see this is like the whole pipeline code. You'll see that within the pipeline code, there's this thing called $$ category. Now, for those of you who are more of developers inside Mongo, you know that there's really no such thing as $$. Mongo doesn't know this. It's not like a dollar. If it was a dollar, it would think it was a field. But a $$ category is just a string. And what JSON Studio does, it uses this to parameterize things. So, for example, if I go back to my chart and I view this and I open my bind variable display, then you'll see that category is mapped to software. And this pull down are all of the different types that exist in the schema. So if you remember, the Schema Analyzer, which tells you what the schema looks like, also tells you things like distinct values. And so, for example, I now can say, well, now I don't want to focus on software. I want to focus on, say, biotech. So I'll pick biotech and I'll redraw the chart, and you'll see something different. You'll see, because what it did was it ran the entire query, and it produced a new set of results, and the results were the acquisitions that are happening within biotech. And so me as a business user, I would never know all the details. I would just be given a published chart, and I would have to give it the value that I want to bind for this category attribute. Okay, that's really all I would need to do. Okay, so let me show you kind of what you can then later do once you've published these things. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use 3 queries that I built. Okay, so first I'll show you what they look like. Okay, so each one of these is exactly like the ones we've been building throughout this hour, right? There's a crunch st1. It does some, what is this? It does an unwind, then it does some filtering, then it does some projection. And if I run it, it's really a report that shows me the company, the number of employees, and the year founded. Then I have another one called crunch st2. Let me load that one and run it. Okay, and what I have, I don't remember. Oh, I have a breakdown by state, right? So the state in my case is a parameter. You can see that I'm filtering on all states by a certain bind variable, certain value that I get from the outside, and I get how many per city, how many per city within that state. And the last one is one that I forget what it is. One sec. Okay, that per state shows me how many acquisitions there were per year. Okay, so again, there's a filter here by the state, and then there's a grouping by year on how many acquisitions there were. And so each one of these is an analytic query that a power user built, and then they published it, and they published this with a parameter. So how would I now call these things from the outside? So I can be in a totally different place, right? I have no idea what a JSON Studio is. I have no idea what these aggregation pipelines are. Somebody just gives me a name. Okay, so what does it mean that they give me a name? Let me give you an example. I'll put a URL in here, and I'll run it. Okay, and I get a report. This URL could be something somebody sent to me. This URL could be something that's put on some page. But let's look at what really this URL looks like. So what this URL looks like is it just says go to the gateway and run the crunch st1 query on the company's collection and output it as a report. And at the end, I just have to give it which state I want to run this. So this is how I pass my parameter. Or I can do this with Java or curl or Python or Perl or any other thing. Right? And if I want to get something else like Colorado, then I just change the bind variable and I get the companies that are in Colorado. Okay, so this is what it looks like for a user who doesn't need to know all of the details, just has to get a name. Okay, and the same is true for a graph. I can take this other query that I've built, and again, all I would say is I want to run it on the company's data. It's called crunch st2, and I want the output to be a graph. So if I run this thing, then I get a graph. And in this case, I'm going to get the breakdown of the startups within different towns in Massachusetts. So most of them are in Boston, a lot in Cambridge, a lot in Waltham. Whoever lives in Massachusetts knows that this makes sense. Okay. And so the last thing I can do with this is now embed this into a dashboard. So let me show you a dashboard, what a dashboard looks like. And I built this in 5 minutes, so you'll have to excuse me. It's doesn't look very nice, but I want it to be as simple as possible. So let me show you the source. The whole source for this is like 80 pages of HTML, out of which I don't know, about 50 of them is this stuff. It's really just a selection box for the different states. So there's no code over here whatsoever, just selecting all the states. And there are 3 iframes. Each iframe is going to hold one of these outputs, either a report or a graph or whatnot. And really the only code I have is up here. It's the function that gets called when I select one of these values from the pull down. And all that happens is these URLs that I created or that I showed you that say, you know, I want you to act upon the company's data and call Crunch S1 and create a graph. Or I want you to call Crunch ST3 and create a graph. And I want you to call Crunch ST1 and create a report. That's all I need to do. And then if I do this and I pick a state, what will happen is now it will go into the gateway and it will run all of these reports. So it will run the three pipelines and it will get the data for the pipelines and it will say, okay, how do I render this? Do I need to render this as a report or do I need to render this as a chart? And it will present it. And these are all active things like, you know, again, I can go and change these. These are all full-blown D3 graphs that you get into your dashboards with writing zero code, really zero code. And so that's the idea, is that you make the power user very fast in building things and very fast in publishing things, and then get all your business users to view these very, very easily. Okay. So let me think. What else? So before I go into questions and answers, you know, just in terms of the architecture, the studio and the gateway are things that you can either run from your desktop or you can run as a shared server. So for example, I'm running this on my local laptop, but if you know, if you were a certain department and you had you know, 5 power users and 20 business users, you could just install it on one shared server and everybody would be running off the same machine. The installation looks exactly the same. Same is true if you're running this on the cloud. If your MongoDB is sitting in the cloud, it may make sense for you to put this on a, say it's on Amazon, to put this on an EC2 machine, for example, just because it's closer to the data, but it doesn't have to be that way. And then kind of before we go into questions, I just wanted to mention if there are any follow-ups that you want by email, you know, you should contact Roy, and the email is roy@jsonar.com. And there are, and we're also, you know, for any participant in the webinar, there is a discount code that you can use called MugTX. It's good for 1 month after the webinar. Okay, so with that, I'll open up to questions, Zach.
Feel free to ask a question at this time. If you have anything, you can obviously pose a question in the chat box. Leave it open for a few minutes.
Or probably you can also unmute.
Mm-hmm. Everybody is unmuted, so you should be able
Oh,
to
okay.
speak. Okay, I guess, well, there's no questions. I'll be sending out, this is Zach, I'll be sending out an email with this discount code and Roy's contact information after this webinar. We really appreciate everyone's time. Obviously, our website is jsonar.com. We will be having monthly webinars. Our next webinar is coming up in November, and I'll be sending out some details about that shortly. If you have any questions, feel free to email us. You can email Roy at jsonar. I'm Zach at jsonar as well, and we thank you very much for your time.
Hello?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hey, I've got one quick question, and it relates to the cost of the software. So I looked at doing an evaluation, but when I looked at the evaluation, it pretty much says that it's the code is only good for 24 hours. Is that true?
No. The evaluation is good for it's around 2 weeks. So it depends. It's either 2 or 3 weeks. It depends when the automated system loaded the software and when you download it. But the
Okay.
evaluation is good for 2 weeks, and the subscription and the evaluation is not there's no cost to the evaluation. That's free, and the subscription
Yep.
is good for a year.
Okay, so the subscription, how much is that for? Let's say we were going to start using it just on our laptop to just, to be able to go, go through a lot of this MongoDB data. Um, if we were doing it on our laptop, what would the cost be for a single subscription?
So single subscription is $495 per person.
And that's for a year?
Yes, that's for a year.
That's for a year. And what does that come with?
It comes with all of the JSON Studio tools. So everything you saw today, plus ETL tooling, plus QA tooling, plus all the things I didn't cover today. It's just one cost for the entire tool set.
Okay, and what about training?
Training is separate. Usually what we recommend is a half-day training.
Mm-hmm.
That's usually enough for everybody, and we could do this if you have like 2 or 3 people, it might make sense for you to send them to a shared classroom. But if you have like 5 people or over, then we could do this on site at your site
All right. And where are you guys located?
in Boston, outside of Boston, in
You're outside
Lexington.
of Boston. Okay. And do you guys have training or events at your location?
We do. It depends on how many people come together at a certain point in time. But yes, we do have those. They're probably less frequent than on site. Usually when people start using the tool, they usually have at least 5 people, and it just is more convenient to do it on their site.
Mm. Okay, because it's probably and if we decide to go with this, I'm going to look at the evaluation, and if I have questions during the evaluation, are you guys available to answer those, or is it pretty much I got to play around with it myself to get it work?
No,
To
no, we will answer questions and support you through your evaluation.
Okay, so I will go through the evaluation phase, and then I'll let you guys know where we're going to go from there. But I thought it was because I like I'm tired of the curly braces as well. When you're doing the aggregation framework, it's a beast. But if this makes it easier and allows us to process data quicker and get to answers a lot easier, then I can see the value in it. But we'll go through the evaluation and see how it goes.
Okay,
We
sounds good.
Quick question for you, Steve. How did you hear about us?
I have a friend that told me to jump on and just listen to see if this would be something we'd be interested in. We
Very
have a
good.
found, yeah, we have a foundation that does a lot that does a lot of research, and a tool like this using MongoDB would be very advantageous to kind of get people up to speed on being able to just get to the answer without needing to know JavaScript or MongoDB in general, but just being able to get to the answer quick, and that's really what we're trying to do. So this could be a good tool for us. I'm gonna take a look at it, and then we'll see where we go from there.
Thank you very much for joining us. Really appreciate that insight.
All right, guys, great job. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Yep.
We'll leave the phone open for just a minute or two. If there's anybody else with some more questions, we'd love to cover them.